So can we see this fine? Okay. So yeah, welcome everybody. Thanks very much for joining. And yeah, let me tell you a bit about behind the scenes of a project that I did in Colombia with Rachel Meager and Leo Iacovoni, which is looking at Bayesian impact evaluation of a Colombian manufacturing and export improvement program. And I'm going to be talking about firms in Colombia. And so these pictures here sort of give you some sense of, the size of the firms that we might be talking about, sort of 40, 50 person firms on average that are making a variety of things that are looking at manufacturing. And sorry, I'm just getting the, what am I trying to do in this paper? Well, we're trying to do two things. We're trying to do both a substantive evaluation of a policy intervention that's trying to improve exports and productivity of firms in Colombia. And so it's going to be a government program where there's 200 firms, and the treatment group in this experiment is going to get a diagnostic which tells them about, the issues involved in their productivity and their exporting. And then they're going to get 190 hours of technical assistance from consultants that cost about $14,000 per firm. So quite expensive consulting that's coming in to try and help them improve their exports and improve productivity. And we're going to compare that to a control group that just gets this diagnostic. And so this is a relatively, expensive experiment. The government came to us and wanted to learn whether it was working, but you can see the sample size is not super big. So, we only have 100 in treatment and 100 in control. And so we wanted to see how much could we learn from this type of setting, and could we learn a little bit more if we also brought in some additional information. And so this is where we're trying to make a new methods contribution as well, where we're going to use a Bayesian approach and see whether we can bring in informative priors and, look at using them in this impact evaluation to try and learn as much as we can from this study. And so it's, the experiment's trying to, both look at the impact of this program as well as look at how do you do a Bayesian impact evaluation with informative priors. Okay, and so what this intervention is trying to diversify exports and expand productivity. So Colombia has, pretty concentrated exports, pretty low productivity, and so they want to expand the range of industries and the range of firms that are involved in exporting. And so, as I mentioned, it's going to use these consultants to come in. And one of the other things that makes statistical power quite difficult and learning from the setting quite difficult is that these firms are all very heterogeneous. They range in size from 2 to 750 employees. So I mentioned, the average size is sort of 40, 50. Half of them are exporting already. Half of them said they'd like to export, but they're not exporting at the time. And then there's a whole range of different sectors. So they're producing all types of stuff. And then this intervention comes in and helps them get their quality up to the standard needed for international markets, helps with productivity methods so that they can produce more efficiently, looks at how do you manage your work as well, your commercial strategy, which markets should you be focusing on, and then energy efficiency. Can you reduce the energy cost of production as well. And so the consultants would work on commercial strategy, and then they'd work on 2 out of the other 4 areas, depending on the diagnostic in terms of, where you were thinking that you needed the help most. Okay, and so, we're going to bring in prior information here. So just as we're going to do in this behind the scenes seminar, where you're getting asked about, what you expect to happen here, we're trying to bring in informative priors about the outcomes that this program's looking at. So what priors do we look at? Well, we pre-registered 8 specific primary export outcomes. The extensive margin, are you exporting at all? And then using, very detailed export data, we're looking at, how many products are you exporting? Which countries are they going to? Are you exporting to somewhere you've never exported before? How many exports do you have per worker, etc. And then, one thing that we're clear about is that we're going to ask them about the intention to treat effect. And so we explain, we want the effect of being offered this service, even if you don't use all of the service, or if you don't use it at all. So, we also elicited priors about, what percentage of the firms that signed up for this program actually took the program up. So then how should we elicit these priors? Well, as well as getting just point estimates of, what do you think is going to be the impact on exporting, we really wanted to get the full distribution, because we're going to use this Bayesian approach where we get the full initial distribution, we bring in the data, and then we update that to get a posterior distribution. And so we used what's called a sort of stones and bins method, where we give you a grid with different ranges, and then we give you the equivalent of stones representing 5%, or tokens each representing 5%. And so you could say, okay, I think there's a 10% chance that the impact on exporting will be 5 to 10 percentage points, and I'll put in some some probability mass in that area, and then I'll put in more probability mass in the area that the impact's going to be 0 to 3 percentage points, etc. And so you have this grid, and you're filling out this grid, and then we can fit a distribution to your elicited priors. So whose priors are we going to get? So here we got priors from 3 different groups: from academics who've done work before on management improvement programs or Colombian firms. We elicit priors directly from the policymakers in Colombia who are involved in making decisions about this program. So, the Vice Minister of Commerce, the technical director of the planning agency, the ones in charge of the program. So we ask them, what do you expect this program to do? And then we also ask them about their decision rules. What would this program need to do for you to want to continue this program or scale it up? And then finally, we ask decision makers in some of the program firms themselves, when you sign up for this program, what are you expecting to get out of this program? And so then we've got priors from 3 different types of groups, and we'll aggregate those by groups and then fit a probability distribution to each. And then we can compare that to what we might get from using the literature. One of the problems is often we're doing work in the literature where there's not a lot of existing information. And so then we're able to get something from that, and then a diffuse prior, which doesn't bring in any informative information, and we can just sort of see how much does the Bayesian approach mean compared to just a frequentist approach. So, we're going to use a follow-up survey, which looks at data on the specific practices they're using, and then administrative data on exports and employment. Okay, and so, when we look at the practices they're doing, we measure a bunch of different practices in the specific areas they're doing work on, as well as sort of specific export practices, like, are you going to trade fairs? Are you talking to foreign buyers? Are you trying to deal with foreign quality standards? And what we saw was that the commercial practices and operations practices that these consultants were focusing on, firms improved in those, and so they improved their general management practices, but we didn't see any improvement in specific export practices of anything up on estimates negative. And then if we look at the trajectory of these firms, the treatment group in blue and the control group in red, what you see is these were all firms whose exports were increasing over time going into the program. And then after the program, you see them sort of on somewhat parallel trends for a year or so afterwards. And then if anything, the treatment group is having their exports fall while the control group is continuing to improve. And so this is, your ocular econometrics suggest maybe this program's not working the way you would like it to be working. So, as I mentioned, we have these priors. So we fitted these, this is the prior for what academics thought was going to be the change in the exporting at all. And so you can see here, that they expect on average, some improvement. The mass is at around sort of 6 percentage points. Or 0.006 here, but there's a range, there's a tail where this program could work really well, there's a small negative tail where they thought maybe this would backfire, but mostly academics thought that this program would have some positive impact. This is what our OLS estimate is, where it's pretty much around 0. So then we say, okay, you went with this prior coming in, this is what the data shows, how much should you update that prior in light of this data? And this is what the Bayesian estimation is going to give us. It's going to give us this posterior distribution, which says, here, for this outcome, the data is really informative. What, you might have thought that this program was going to work going in, for this binary outcome of export at all, we get a pretty precise effect around 0, and you should almost completely update that prior you had. And so your posterior is going to look very much like the OLS estimate. And so we have this for a range of different outcomes. And so this is, again, showing, I was just showing you academics here, but this is showing you, for academics, policymakers, firms, and from the literature, this is what your prior would look like. This is what the data shows. And so then, we update, and you can see all these posterior distributions look very much like the OLS estimate for this. So, so from here, this prior information is not adding anything, but the data is quite informative, and we learn a lot from this experiment about what happens on the extensive margin. In contrast, for something like export diversification, are you doing something for a new product in a new country? Here, people didn't really expect that much. The priors are sort of pretty close to zero. There's a possibility of a long tail of things working well. And our posterior confidence intervals then are actually narrower than you would get from just OLS. And so this was one of the hopes going in, is if you bring in this information where it aligns quite well with what the data show, you could actually be even more confident in the outcomes. And so for this, we're even more confident that this doesn't have much impact on export diversification. And then finally, for something like export value, which is a very noisy, very skewed measure, what you see is that our treatment estimate is actually very strongly negative at the bottom here, but with a massive confidence interval. And so what you see is that the priors and the posteriors for the firms, the policymakers, and the academics all look very similar to one another. There's very little updating here. Whatever you thought going in, the data is so uninformative that you should just sort of stick with your priors. You're not learning very much from the study about this type of outcome, because we only have 200 firms. Export value is very highly skewed and very noisy, and so you shouldn't update very much from this. And so, finally, we can put it all together in some sort of export outcome index where you're doing an index of all these different measures, and what you see is sort of partial updating. This program seems to have had a near zero impact in 2019 and a negative impact in 2020. And when you bring in these priors, you sort of update towards that, but not completely. So maybe you're a little less confident that this program had a negative impact than you would be if you just looked at the data itself. But this program's definitely not working the way you would have liked it to. And so then we can use that to make policy threshold estimates as well, to say what's the % chance that this exceeded some cutoff that that policymakers wanted using these different priors. And for all these outcomes like exporting at all, or products, or innovation, you're basically seeing there's very little chance this program had the effect that was needed for scale up, whereas there is some chance for export value or things, just because we don't learn very much from those outcomes. So putting this all together, this was something where we're both doing this applied Bayesian impact evaluation in a real world setting with a big policy, and there's a lot of practical issues that arose in terms of how to implement this that we needed to solve. And then we're also showing how these informative priors can be helpful when these interventions are expensive and we have relatively limited sample sizes, and we can't just go and replicate it or add some more sample. And we think this could also be useful for things like looking at treatment effect. And then for the specific program, we learned that our data are much more informative about whether this program helped firms to export at all. It really didn't. It was very precise on that than we did about export value or export labor productivity. So I think that's the quick overview of the paper. Let me stop sharing so that Wetzel can tell us next steps.
I'm actually gonna take over. That was really exciting to see all the various pieces of the puzzle, all the many elements, and how you had to manage this. That must have been a really challenging study to pull off. If anyone from the audience has any questions, please post if you want in the chat your question. Otherwise, David, we were thinking that we would talk a little bit about collaborations in general, because clearly you're working on a lot of projects that are large scale, where you're going to have often a large team with different skills. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
So just to add to that, I'm going to now post the link to the survey as well. So while David is discussing collaborations, please also feel free to use the link to fill the survey. Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, I think certainly with these large field projects, there's it's much more removed from the, all you need is your computer and maybe a research assistant. There's many steps of this process, from working with the policymakers to the data collection to in this paper the technical expertise to do this Bayesian approach. And so it is one of these skills that we're not really taught so much necessarily early on, is how to manage these large teams and how to figure out those steps. And it's something you sort of learn a bit as you go. And I was very lucky early on to work with some more experienced people on working in the field when I'd never done field work before, to learn a bit about that. One of the advantages of being at the World Bank is that we have these country teams in many different countries who have links with the government, who have knowledge of survey companies as well. And then we worked with Innovations for Poverty Action on this as well, who have a lot of experience in the field management. And so, in some sense, part of the success of collaboration is just choosing good people who know how to do many of the steps of that production process with you, and then trying to find other good people to co-author with and collaborate with. And so this was something where I reached out directly to Rachel Meager after having seen their work on using Bayesian approaches in another setting as well. And so we had some discussions over Zoom, and then we're able to kind of make this collaboration happen. So this was a case where I was sort of reaching out of the blue to someone I'd never met before to try and set up a collaboration based on knowledge of what they're doing, and thinking that this could be of interest to them. But there's other cases where those collaborations come from meeting people at conferences, or just from my colleagues around me, etc.
In terms of knowledge of the field, so I'm trying to think a little bit, clearly contextual knowledge, I'm guessing, is incredibly important when you go to field settings. How do you think about that when you form partnerships on a project?
Yeah, and I think this, it depends a little bit on what the type of the intervention is as well. And I mean, it's always very useful to have that contextual knowledge, but if you're doing something where it's about firm productivity in a manufacturing process, that knowledge maybe is sort of more similar across countries. Of there's a set of universal best management practices that we think all firms should be doing, than if I was trying to do something where I'm trying to overcome some cultural constraint to women's labor force participation, or something where that may be a lot more countries specific. So that's one thing. But the second thing is certainly just part of it is going and chatting directly with the people you're trying to have involved in these projects. So we went and chatted to the firms themselves, and are really trying to field test some of the ideas we have and see if they make sense in light of those conversations, and talk with then consultants who work in Colombia and with the government themselves. But a lot of that is deferring expertise to the government who's designing this program, to the World Bank team that's working with that government, and then to a survey company that's working in that country. And so we have survey questions that we would like to do. They get tested and then come back with, well, in this context you need to change it this way. And so I think at least to be able to do work like this in many different countries, you need to not try and think that you can do everything in and learn everything about one place. You try and learn from those around you, but also rely on them to know better than you sometimes.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Maybe another question on collaboration is something around team size. So over the years, you've had maybe quite a bit of variation in terms of like how many people on a project. What do you think works best in terms of, size of the group? Do you have some views on that?
Yeah, I mean, I have found it hard when we get to sort of papers where things where there's there's a team of sort of 7 or 8 people, and sometimes that works well when it's a more interdisciplinary team, and then there's very sort of delineated expertise. And so I've done some work with psychologists where, we have a couple of psychologists on the team, and then it's, very clear that, they bring a lot of knowledge in this area, and they can write up this part of the paper, and they can kind of do this bit, and then we can kind of do this bit, and it's easier to divide up. But when you have a large team and everyone's sort of not as specialized, it is a little bit more difficult to try and figure out what everyone should be doing. And so, teams have kind of, I think it's worked best when we've had 2 or 3 of us on as the kind of core people driving a project, and for a lot of things, apart from, when it's these more interdisciplinary things. And so, but it's always, it's a bit of trial and error trying to, and again, I think people there's some bits where people, specialize in different parts of the production process. And so then those larger teams have sort of worked well where, some people have really put a lot of the effort in early on with the setup of the project and working with the government. And, but then when it gets to the paper writing, they're not doing so much of the paper writing stage. And so, one of the issues in economics is when do you get authorship on these, and what do you need to write to be an author or not? And that's varies a little bit depending on what the incentives and what the how long this process takes. If someone was involved for 1 or 2 years at the start of a project that ends up taking 7 or 8 years, how do you think about that? So these are all things that I don't have bright line rules for. I guess it's a little bit of negotiation and working out from project to project.
This is super interesting. I mean, thinking about the interdisciplinarity, and especially when you have different norms in the profession on what is required to be on the paper, that might actually also involve some difficult conversations that probably are best to have early on, when it's possible.
Yeah, I mean, and it also depends on sort of which stage of the career people are at as well. And so, when you're younger, being one of 8 authors on a paper, it can not be as beneficial to you sometimes. And so then you may want to try and keep the team relatively small to protect the junior persons, and then have that then is later on maybe you're like, oh, it doesn't really matter who's on it. It's sometimes it's like that, but I think it's it's something where certainly we've seen an increase in this over time, and people are now sort of getting more credit, I think, for being part of these big teams than they perhaps used to, where there was a divide by the number of authors type of credit, which somehow that doesn't seem to work for the amount of effort you put into these projects. So.
Yeah, no, absolutely, fair enough. So I think we've made good progress in terms of collecting predictions from the audience. Vatsal, do you want to say something about that?
Yes, yeah. I think we can start discussing the survey responses. For anyone who's not filled the survey yet, please let me know if you have any difficulty accessing it as well. And I'm gonna share my screen now. All right. So David, what we can do is I can just walk through these questions step by step, and then at any point, I would just like to also emphasize to the audience, if you want to ask questions, please feel free to jump in. As David said, as Severine said, this is meant to be interactive, so it'll be great to have your questions. So the first question we asked you was, how many years do you think it took the researchers to go from conceiving the idea to getting it published? So here you can see the audience's responses to that. And here you see...
I love this optimistic person who's there, right? Optimistic little hump down at the bottom there. This is fantastic.
Yeah, and someone who thought 10
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. David, do you want to take it off right now, or should we do 1 or 2 more questions?
Why don't we do a couple more? Yeah.
Yeah, let's do that.
So just to, just making clear that 8 is the answer, is the correct
Yes.
answer. Yeah, yeah. So yes.
So I have a question about this. So is 8 generally above the median for you, or like below where does this fit in terms of your portfolio of projects?
Yeah, no, certainly I think it's above the median, but it depends a little bit on, um, for field projects versus I do a bunch of non-field projects too. But I would say, probably 6 years might be the median for a field project. There's this tendency now, and this is something that I think there's a difference a little bit between disciplines, for us to, really push for longer term follow-ups and, oh, it's great. You've got a study with a 1-year follow-up, but, show us the 3-year follow-up and then, we'll really believe that this thing sticks. And so, pushing out multiple versions of the paper where, here's a paper where there's the 6-month results, and then here's another paper where there's the 18-month, and, it would be nice if we sort of could do that, I think, but sometimes you and have or somehow be able to dynamically update the publication or something. But at the moment, it's you sort of try and put everything together, and that makes these papers long if you're doing things where it takes time to see the outcomes emerge. So.
Right. All right. Let's move to the next one. So how many times do you think the presenter presented the paper at external conferences or seminars before submitting it? So these are the responses, and the correct answer is more than 4 times.
Yeah, and this is something where I think it varies a lot from paper to paper, but this one we certainly presented. And, well, and before submitting it to a journal, actually, let me come back to the before a journal when we talk a little bit more about some of the other things. But this was we're partly trying to get the feedback from different audiences, and partly, it was a paper we're very excited about. And so we're, when we're invited to present somewhere, this went sort of to the top of my list of things I wanted to present. So that's partly it, as well as sort of, how many occasions do you get to try and do it?
All right. Okay. So now we'll have a few questions about the submission process. So the first one is, how many journals do you think the researchers submitted the paper to before it was accepted, where it was published? Yeah, it's entirely spread out. We can take a couple of these and then come back to it. So the next one is, how many rounds of revisions do you think the paper went through after receiving the first response? Majority said 2. And finally, how many months do you think it took the researchers to address the comments of the referees? And yeah, okay, some people are still filling in this question, but yeah. David, do you want to talk about this? I can go back to the first one here.
Yeah, and so this was a bit of a little bit unusual in that we submitted this as a registered report first to the Journal of Development Economics. And so for those of you who are not familiar, the Journal of Development Economics has this registered reports feature where you could submit the paper and what you're going to do before you've got any of the results for it. And then they accept it or reject it on the basis of how interesting it is. But the nice feature they also have is that it doesn't commit you to publishing in that paper, and so you're allowed to go and try, and submit it to a top journal if you want to, once you've got the results. But you can come back and also submit it to the JDE. And so this was the very first paper accepted as a registered report at the JDE when they were trying this out. And so we submitted it there. We got the registered report acceptance from there, and then we went away and did the experiment and waited and saw the results, and then then we went to Econometrica, and we were very lucky that it was accepted at Econometrica as the first journal we submitted it to as the new paper. So it's kind of a, whether the answer should be 2 or 1 journals depends on whether you think about that registered report or not.
Sounds good. Do you want to talk about the revision process?
Yeah, and so here, while we were lucky that it was the first journal that we submitted it to, we did have quite a lot of revisions to do, and a big part of this was the sort of framing of the paper, which we're going to come back to too, and the sort of this tension between the paper trying to do two things, it trying to be the substantive look at this export improvement program, as well as this methodological piece on Bayesian impact evaluation. And so when we submitted it to the journal, it was 45 pages with a 20-page appendix, and the editor said, make it 30 pages maximum with a 20-page maximum appendix, and was very strict on that. And so, big part of, but then, here's a bunch of questions to also deal with in that response. So it took us quite a while to both pare that paper down and get answers to all those technical questions. And so, the first revision was really, quite different from the first sorry, the first version was quite different from the submission because of all these changes of tightening it down. And then the other revisions were relatively minor, but dealing with technical points and going through. And so the first revision was really the big one, but it did take us several more rounds after that to kind of get it through.
Right. And in terms of the time it took you to work on these revisions, I think you said 8. We've got quite a lot of people who thought it was way more than that.
Well, so this was yeah, and I was thinking here more about how long it took to get the first revision back, and then these other revisions were relatively minor, and so maybe didn't add. We took about 8 months to deal with the first revision. Then there was time to hear back from that and things, and so these other people are correct that the time from when we submitted it to when we got the acceptance was a couple of years, but part of that was it sitting with the journal for quite a while, and then so I'm not exactly sure what the right answer to this question should be, given multiple revisions and how to count these other bits. And I should say, it's not just the referees, it's also dealing with the data editors and things at the end of the process that take some of that time too, and getting. So that's, not addressing the comments of the referees, but addressing, making sure that you've got, all the forms in place for this replication, and things can take a little time too.
David, I just wanted to ask a question on the JDE part of things. How were you accepted with your proposal right away, or did you have also to revise something at that stage?
So it was a conditional acceptance right away there, where they said, we're willing to conditionally accept it, conditional on you clarifying one or two minor things. And so again, this was the very, they were trying this out, and so I think at that stage they were just eager to have some interesting sounding things come in and try, and so that process. But the other point on that is they don't really want to have a lot of revisions, because they're trying to get this in before you get your results. And so if you have a long process to kind of revise, then people may have their results, and then it's kind of having it as a pre-results acceptance becomes less there. So there can be, I've had other papers there where there was a request for more revision, and one of the nice things is you can potentially get some comments on revising your design or revising your survey questions to make sure that you actually collect the right outcome, or that maybe you can tweak the design slightly. And so we had one where there was a bit more of a major revision, and we had enough time to but it was like, you've got 3 months to kind of turn this around and get this in to be a pre-acceptance still. So we were able to do that.
David, I remember you had some slides about this as well, in case you want to share it now, or you want to share it after we go through the discussion on the pitch.
Yeah, why don't we could jump to that now. So if I share it, mine again, which is also going to beyond the pitch. But this is from the I thought people would be interested to see. This is from the JDE's the response of the 2 reviewers from the initial submission of the registered report. And reviewer 1 says, this is interesting. I think it contributes to this small literature that where we don't know a lot about RCTs with larger firms, and so it's really nice for that reason. But it's not really clear what they expect this Bayesian analysis to add. I'm not very enthused about that. And then reviewer 2 says, I'm excited that they're doing this. The impact evaluation itself is not that novel, but the Bayesian approach is really exciting. And so, this is part of so luckily both of them found something of interest. So this is part of the sort of potential benefit of having this dual focus where you're trying to make a methods point and a substantive point, but it also has referees who might be trying to push you in very different directions on where they want the paper to go, with some more interested in one than the other. And we also got a little bit of that econometric, but less so. But this was at the at the JDE, certainly this difference between the two. We'll come back to yours, and then we can come back to some other points.
David, how many reviewers did you have?
We're at the JDE 2 and at Econometrica, surprisingly only 2 as well. I've had other papers at top journals with up to 6 reviewers, which is very difficult to deal with. But the editor was very at Econometrica was also very involved and had very detailed comments. So was more than a additional reviewer, I would say, in terms of having very clear instructions and being very involved in sort of how we should take the paper forward. So
a bit easier to aggregate opinions. That's good when you have different parts and people might disagree on the emphasize.
All right, let's go to the next few questions on the pitch, on the evolution of the paper. So first one is, how much do you think the final results of this paper aligned with the original prior about what they would find? This is what the audience said, and what you said was somewhat aligned. We can take the next one as well. How many times do you think, and this relates to the previous things that you just mentioned, how many times do you think the pitch of the research paper was revised? And the response is once. And finally, once the pitch was finalized, how many times do you think the introduction was changed purely for stylistic reasons? And the response is 3 to 5 times. All right. We may want to take these in one go.
Yeah. So here I think the key thing was this difference between the was sort of how much we were focusing on the intervention versus on the Bayesian part of it, and in terms of how much the final results aligned with that original prior. We went into this program hoping that this program was going to work and succeed in expanding exports and things. And I think if we had found this program to do a lot more positive things there, then we may have had a bit more of the emphasis on how did this program increase exports for these firms, which was a big goal of the country, as well as the Bayesian, and then the Bayesian part strengthening this as well, versus here when we're really not finding any impact of this program. And so then we're leaning a little bit more into the just okay, you didn't find much impact, but how certain are we of that, and in this Bayesian framework helping us? So it was still sort of very much in line with that. Okay, this really is trying to do something on the Bayesian, bringing this Bayesian part in, but how much we lean into the substantive part. And then part of that is also, so it's so this is the results itself. The result, our prize, as you saw, as well as the prize of the policymakers and the academics and the firms. Everyone thought this was this program was going to do something, and it was really a surprise when it didn't do more than it was. But then in terms of this pitch, that was sort of more of a subtle shift, and then more of a shift during the revision, I would say, from the editor sort of saying, focus more on the methods side and cutting down the paper, sharpen it by having a little bit less on all the intervention. So that was really coming through there. And then I think in the introduction is just then kind of going back and forth between how long the introduction should be. And so again, this was something where there's been this style in a lot of economics papers for people to write really, really long introductions, where you've almost seen half the paper described in the introduction. And we weren't that bad, but we had a 5-page introduction, I think, and the editor said, this needs to be a lot sharper and shorter there. And so, trying to figure out how to get across what we wanted to in less space was part of that. So, I'm glad that we were pushed that way. I don't like us having 8-page introductions to some of the papers that I get to referee. I think at that stage you might as well just make that the full paper and turn it into a science level science or AR insights or something paper, and not have to write the rest of the paper when you're writing an intro that long. But let's see.
I had a question. So one of the reports that you like, the quotes that you mentioned, talked about pre-specifying the Bayesian part of the paper. Is that something you did, and do you think doing that would like help you?
Yeah. So I mean, we pre-specified there that we were going to elicit these priors, and then when we got the priors, we registered those, we added those to our registration. So I think that is helpful, just sort of in part. This is how people are also using the social science prediction platform potentially, is to sort of document what people thought was going to happen beforehand, because there's that nothing surprising once you know the answer type of feeling. And so I think that was useful. But we did set out in this registered report a lot of the details of what we are going to do in the estimation. So that was sort of specifying a lot of the estimation, but then there were sort of some technical issues that you only encounter when you're actually implementing it. And so we had a lot of randomization strata, and so putting them in on a Bayesian framework was actually quite tricky, and there had to be a lot of regularization because you were trying to estimate all these different fixed effects, which plays havoc with it. So that was kind of one thing. Or thinking about non-OLS approaches to and if you're trying to model extensive margins and intensive margins, then our priors, we would have actually needed to know where people thought the priors were starting from, as well as where they thought they were. And so non-linear priors are much harder to think about. And so we never elicited non-linear priors, but that was sort of one of the surprises. So there's sort of a number of surprises that always arise, that you can't perfectly pre-register everything that's going to end up being what you did. But we had a lot down there that and certainly the main outcomes and everything was registered, that we're going to look at there too.
All right. Okay, let's get to the last part of the survey, and then maybe we can maybe if you want to share your slides after that, and we can also open up questions.
Yeah.
So this was about how challenging people think each of these tasks were for you. Coming up with the research idea, so the average is 1.9. Developing the research idea, that's 3.1 on average. Data collection, that's 3.7. Data analysis, 2.6. Writing and structuring the paper, 2.8. And navigating the peer review process, 2.9. So these are audience averages. So they found the data collection to be the most challenging, and your responses are right here. So this was on a scale of 1 to 5. And similarly, we had a question on time use, on what percentage of total calendar time spent by the research team on the paper was spent on each of these activities. And again, aligned with the previous response. People said on average 27% of the time was spent on data collection, and this is the remaining. And that's what you said. For you, interesting. That's yeah. For you, writing and structuring the paper took the most amount of time. Do you wanna quickly talk about this, and then we can open it up?
Yeah, so I mean, one thing that was a little bit different here is that Colombia, because we were working with these larger firms and we were looking at exports as an outcome, Colombia has, export admin data tends to be pretty good because it all goes through the customs and and so you can get data at for every transaction basically of this firm sold this product at this price to this country, and we had all that aggregated up to so we did collect our survey, but we were sort of using for our main outcomes this administrative data. So calendar time wise, it wasn't. I mean, we are waiting for the time past, after the intervention, but that was, we're looking at impacts sort of in the first 18 months or so after the intervention, and so relative to, it was really just a lot of it. This analysis and writing of the paper and things was partly the other thing I would say is just in terms of our calendar time. The data collection, because you're using this admin data, there's some passive time where you're just waiting for time to pass, whereas the writing and structuring paper and analysis and things is active time. And so, it was really, a lot of time in trying to do this analysis and put it all together. But yeah, let me then share my slide of these kind of other few behind the scenes things, and then I'd love to hear if people have got other questions. And so, I had these a couple of other things that I thought would be interesting for people to see from behind the scenes. And so the first thing that we registered this, we did we did this registered report that was accepted. We put it in the AAA registry, and one issue was just we asked them. The JDE was excited that they had this one accepted, and we said, can you please not make public the country name or the name of the program when we're doing this, because we were worried that somehow our firm might Google the name of the program and then see that they were in this experiment, and we didn't want to have issues arising from either complaints because the control group got a diagnostic, and so they still were getting told you're getting this program of it's diagnostic to help you, and we wanted them to not change their behavior but also not be afraid to answer surveys and things. And so this is an issue always when you're sort of making public things when they're underway, and I think the chances are low that things can go badly from having a lot of publicity while they're underway, but they're not zero, and so I'm very cautious on that. And so that was sort of one thing that I thought would be interesting for people. The second thing was that as mentioned, this was a program to improve exports and to increase productivity. And we registered we worked with the program, we agreed with them on these outcomes, we registered these outcomes, put them on the AAA registry and in this registered report. And then the government changed, and new people came in and part of this program. And then when we got the results at the end and said, there was no impact on exports, they said, oh, this was never meant to be an export improvement program anyway. We just look at productivity, and productivity results were very noisy. We didn't actually see anything on productivity, but they were like, well, this was never meant to be an export program. And so having that registration and sort of being able to say, look, we committed to reporting this. The government at the time said that this was this program. We've got the advertising to firms that say that it was this, it really was this type of program. This is where the registration was helpful, not just from the academic commitment device, but from the communication with policymakers and being able to get the results out, advice. We talked about the sharpening of the paper, but trying to cut a third or more of your paper is always interesting. And then the final thing behind the scenes here is just that I thought might be interesting for people, or might spark other questions, is about the sort of tools that you go along with a methods paper. And so the initial Bayesian impact evaluation Rachel did in our Stan, and this Stan is sort of the specialized software for doing Bayesian work, and I could never get it to install on my WellBank computer, and it's quite buggy. We're trying to, we hired a consultant to come in and try and I use Stata and not R. So I said, I'd like to be able to do some of this myself. And so we had an initial consultant who was trying to make Stata Stan work, and we could never get it to work. And so then over time, Stata has increased its Bayesian functions, and there's sort of, it's not as good as Stan, but I realize also in terms of getting other people to potentially want to use these methods, not having a whole separate software you need to install, and that's quite tricky to figure out. It's not going to be great for use. And so we've been sort of trying to work to say, is there a basic version of this that I could do, or that others who want to do it could do? And so we hired another consultant who specializes in Bayesian work in Stata, who helped us develop some basic replication for our paper in that. And so our replication materials do have some of that as well. And I plan on blogging a little bit more about how to use that for people. But it's this question of this is again behind the scenes, because in the paper itself you're not you're really talking about what you're talking about what was done, but not exactly what statistical packages you're using to do it, and the difficulties in using some packages and getting it to run and things. And so there's a lot of fine tuning with these priors as well, and checks to ensure that the Bayesian methods are converging and things that can get built in. And so none of that sort of shows up in the paper, but it's all happening in the background as well. So let me stop sharing there, but then maybe we see what questions people have about anything behind the scenes of the paper or anything else.
All right, we'll open it up for questions. So please feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions.
It was all so clear. Nobody's got any behind the scenes questions here?
Hello.
Hi.
Just wondering, so how long did it take for the data editor at Econometrica to complete the review process for this paper?
So that was actually it was pretty fast. We had, I would say, was within a month, maybe 2 or 3 weeks. We had done a lot of checking ourselves, and had got so it took us a lot of time to get it ready, I would say, to the point where we felt confident that we could give it to them, and they send very detailed instructions and things. And so it's more that process of ensuring all those things comply with the very detailed instructions they have, that took us some time to sort out. And then once because we did a pretty good job of that, then we didn't have to go through a lot of revisions. The thing that tends to come up a lot is about the data provenance and your rights to distribute the data and things, and the statements that you're putting there come up as much as does your code actually run. And so but we have, luckily this didn't take too long.
Thank you. Yeah, I was wondering because my co-authors and I had a paper at the proofreading and data reviewing stage at AER for like a few months. So I was just wondering whether this is typical or not. Probably
No,
not.
I have found at the AER it is a very strict process, and I did have a recent paper at AER Insights where it came back that the hash on one of the files was different, even though the data was exactly the same. I think we'd like resaved the file after adding an additional label to one of the variables. And so then the editor came back and like, well, this hash is different from the version that's on this version, and so they are very fastidious about data provenance and all those steps, and so it's sort of not enough just to say, here's some data and you can use this data and run it and produce our tables, but they're really sort of trying to get as many steps documented as possible, which in light of some recent replicability scandals is useful, but I feel like we could get 90% of the benefit, and that last 10% is very painful for everyone. And so it sort of seems like it can't, many people are taking a lot of time to kind of get all the I's dotted and T's crossed.
We can take a few more questions if anybody has any other questions.
Otherwise, David, thanks so much for your great presentation. It has been really fun, actually. I knew the paper. I think I've learned still so much about the paper from this seminar. And it's fun, actually, to think about priors also right within the seminar and thinking within your paper. So that's something that, I hope we can maybe systematize a little bit more because it seems like in your context that ended up being also very useful.
Yeah, no, definitely. I hope to use them in more work. So yeah, thanks very much, everyone. If there's any other behind the scenes, just reach out to me. So thanks.
Thank you, David. Thank you. All right.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.